Hey there. Feeling a little stuck with those same old weight loss methods, tired of all the big pharma promises.
Yeah,
We get it. It's like a broken record. Eat less, move more, pop a pill.
it is.
But you're thinking bigger. Right. You want to understand what's really going on, especially with your
For
glucose.
sure.
That's what this deep dive is all about. We're going to explore the science of insulin resistance and how it affects your health and weight, all without those quick fixes you're trying to avoid.
Right on. You're not alone in that skepticism. It's a fascinating area, and we're going to unpack some research from Dr. Benjamin Bickman,
Okay.
a leading metabolic scientist who basically is saying, hold up, we've been missing a crucial piece of the puzzle, insulin resistance. And what's alarming is that a whopping 88% of adults in the US have some degree of it. And it's not just about weight, it's linked to a whole host of chronic diseases.
Okay, insulin resistance. I've heard the term, but honestly, it's always seemed a bit vague. Dr. Bickman uses this analogy of a taxi, a passenger, and a bouncer. Can you walk us through that?
Absolutely. So imagine this. Glucose is the passenger trying to get into a muscle cell where it's used for energy. Insulin is the taxi driver, bringing glucose to the cell's door.
Makes sense so far.
The bouncer, those are the insulin receptors on the muscle cell.
So, in a healthy system, the taxi, insulin, shows up with glucose. The bouncer recognizes it, opens the door, glucose gets into the muscle cell, no problem. But with insulin resistance, things get a little messy, right?
Exactly. With insulin resistance, the bouncer doesn't quite recognize the insulin taxi anymore. The signal is fuzzy, so the door doesn't open easily, and the glucose is stuck outside.
And then our bodies overcompensate by producing more insulin, like sending a whole fleet of taxis to that poor muscle cell's door.
Precisely. And here's where it gets tricky. Dr. Bickman's research suggests that these chronically high insulin levels can actually worsen insulin resistance. It's like the bouncer gets so overwhelmed by the constant barrage of taxis, they just stop responding altogether.
So it's a vicious cycle. Insulin resistance leads to higher insulin, which in turn fuels more insulin resistance. No wonder it's an epidemic. So what are some of the things that send us down this path in the first place?
Well, Dr. Bickman talks about two routes to insulin resistance, the fast lane and the slow lane.
Okay.
Let's start with the fast lane, which has three major culprits: stress, inflammation, and, ironically, too much insulin itself.
Wait, so too much insulin can actually cause insulin resistance. That's a bit mind-bending.
It seems counterintuitive, right? But think about it. If your body is constantly flooded with insulin, it becomes desensitized to the signal. It's like turning up the volume on your headphones so high that eventually you can't even hear the music anymore.
Ah, that makes sense. So what kinds of things contribute to those sky-high insulin levels?
Well, a major culprit is frequent eating, especially when your diet is heavy on refined carbohydrates. Every time you eat, especially those fast-digesting carbs, your body releases insulin to deal with the sugar surge. If you're constantly snacking or loading up on processed foods, your insulin levels are on a roller coaster all day long.
So those healthy, low-fat snacks I've been relying on might actually be contributing to the problem.
It's possible, especially if they're highly processed and full of hidden sugars. It's all about looking beyond the labels and understanding how different foods impact your blood sugar and insulin levels.
Okay, so frequent eating and refined carbs are in the fast lane. What about stress and inflammation? How do those fit in?
Well, when you're stressed, your body pumps out hormones like cortisol and adrenaline.
Right, that fight or flight.
Exactly, that fight or flight mode. These stress hormones actually interfere with insulin's ability to do its job. So, even if you're eating all the right things, chronic stress can make your cells less responsive to insulin.
So those late-night deadlines and endless to-do lists could be impacting my glucose more than I realize.
Definitely something to consider. Managing stress through practices like mindfulness, exercise, or just taking some time for yourself can be crucial for improving your insulin sensitivity.
What about inflammation? I know it's linked to a lot of health issues, but how does it impact insulin resistance specifically?
Well, inflammation is basically your body's response to injury or irritation. A little inflammation is normal and even helpful for healing, but chronic inflammation can wreak havoc on your body, including messing with insulin signaling.
What are the biggest contributors to this kind of chronic inflammation that can lead to insulin resistance?
Smoking is a huge one, as is vaping, even though it's often marketed as a healthier alternative. Dr. Bickman's research is pretty eye-opening on this front. Vaping actually seems to be worse than smoking when it comes to inflammation and insulin resistance.
Wow, that's surprising. Why would that be?
Well, it seems that the chemicals in vapes, even without the tar and other byproducts of combustion, still cause significant damage to your airways, triggering a massive inflammatory response. This inflammation then makes your cells much less sensitive to insulin.
So ditching the cigarettes and the vapes is a must for anyone concerned about their insulin levels.
Okay, so we've covered the fast lane to insulin resistance, stress, inflammation, and too much insulin caused by frequent eating and refined carbs. What about this slow lane you mentioned earlier?
The slow lane is all about what's happening in your fat cells and how insulin drives their growth.
Okay.
And this is where it gets really interesting, especially for someone who's food conscious like you. It's not just the amount of fat you have, but the size of your fat cells that plays a crucial role in insulin resistance.
So, two people could have the same amount of body fat, but if one person has more numerous fat cells and the other person has fewer, larger fat cells, the person with the larger fat cells is more likely to have problems. You got it. Think of it this way. A small fat cell is like a well-organized, efficient little factory. It can take in glucose and store fat effectively, responding well to insulin signals. But as the fat cell grows larger, it becomes like a chaotic, overstuffed warehouse. It doesn't function as smoothly and becomes less responsive to insulin's instructions.
So even if I'm not what's traditionally considered overweight, if I have larger fat cells, I could still be on the road to insulin resistance.
That's right. It challenges that whole calories in, calories out paradigm that's often touted as the be-all and end-all of weight management. It's more nuanced than that.
This is fascinating. So it's not just about the number on the scale, it's about the health of our fat cells. But what makes those fat cells grow in the first place? Is it just about eating too much?
Here's where it gets even more interesting. And this is something to really pay attention to if you're trying to ditch those traditional weight loss methods. The key signal for fat cell growth is insulin. In fact, without insulin, gaining weight is virtually impossible, even if you were to eat an excessive amount of calories.
Wait, are you serious? So even if I were to go on a crazy eating spree, if my body wasn't producing insulin, I wouldn't gain weight.
That's exactly what research on people with type 1 diabetes shows. They don't produce insulin, and if they don't take insulin injections, they can eat a ton of food and still not gain weight. It's because insulin is the critical hormone that signals to fat cells to take in energy and grow.
Okay, my mind is officially blown. So insulin is like the green light for fat storage.
Exactly. It's like the key that unlocks the door to your fat cells, allowing them to take in energy from the food you eat and grow larger. But remember, it's not the only factor. There are two variables at play: insulin and calories.
So insulin is the signal and calories are the building blocks.
Precisely. If insulin is high, it's telling those fat cells to expand, but they need the calories, the raw materials, to actually have something to build with. That's why focusing on foods that don't spike your insulin levels can be so impactful for managing your weight and overall health.
This explains why diets like low-carb, high-fat eating plans often work so well for fat loss. They're essentially keeping insulin levels lower, which means less fat storage.
That's exactly right. By controlling those insulin spikes, you're essentially telling your body to use its stored fat for energy instead of constantly packing on more.
This is all incredibly insightful. It really challenges that eat less, move more mantra that we've all been bombarded with for years. It seems like managing insulin is the real key to achieving sustainable weight loss, and more importantly, improving our health.
It's a paradigm shift for sure. And what's even more intriguing is that insulin resistance doesn't just affect our weight, it has much broader implications for our health, potentially even playing a role in conditions like Alzheimer's disease.
Okay, now that's scary,
Yeah.
but also fascinating. Let's talk about that connection.
Yeah, it is a bit unsettling. Dr. Bickman suggests that, we might need to rethink how we view Alzheimer's disease. He believes it could be better understood as insulin resistance of the brain, sometimes called type 3 diabetes.
So instead of just focusing on that plaque buildup in the brain, which is what we usually hear about with Alzheimer's, Dr. Bickman's saying it's more about the brain's inability to use glucose effectively for energy because of insulin resistance.
That's the gist of his argument. And it makes sense when you think about how much energy the brain needs to function properly. It relies on either glucose or ketones for fuel.
But didn't you mention earlier that ketones might actually be a better fuel source for the brain than glucose?
Yes, and that's a key part of Dr. Bickman's hypothesis. Research shows that even when glucose levels are normal, the brain will happily switch to using ketones for energy if they're available. He even suggests that ketones can improve cognitive function in people who already have Alzheimer's.
That's incredible. So if we can help our brains become more metabolically flexible, meaning they can easily switch between using glucose and ketones, we might be able to protect ourselves from cognitive decline.
That's the theory. And managing insulin resistance seems to be a crucial piece of that puzzle.
This is all pretty mind-blowing. So if Alzheimer's is potentially linked to insulin resistance in the brain, what does that mean for how we diagnose and address the problem?
Well, Dr. Bickman emphasizes that we shouldn't just be looking at glucose levels. Measuring insulin levels is crucial for identifying insulin resistance, especially in its early stages, when you might not see any red flags with your blood sugar readings.
So someone could have seemingly normal blood sugar, but their insulin levels could be through the roof, indicating that their body's struggling to process glucose effectively.
Exactly. It's like having a hidden leak in your pipes. Everything seems fine on the surface, but behind the scenes, there's a problem brewing. And unfortunately, as Dr. Bickman points out, many doctors aren't routinely measuring insulin levels.
That's concerning to say the least. It seems like a missed opportunity to catch a problem early on and prevent more serious health issues down the road.
hmm It raises important questions about, how we approach preventative health care. Are we focusing on the right things? Are we missing crucial pieces of information that could help people live longer, healthier lives?
Okay, so we've talked about the fast lane and the slow lane to insulin resistance and its potential link to Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah.
But Dr. Bickman also talks about another surprising factor contributing to insulin resistance.
Environmental toxins.
Right. This is an area of research that doesn't get as much attention, but the findings are pretty alarming. Dr. Bickman's studies suggest that inhaled toxins like diesel exhaust, cigarette smoke, and even vaping can actually contribute to fat cell growth, insulin resistance, and inflammation.
It's crazy to think that just breathing in certain things can impact our metabolic health.
It highlights, how interconnected our environment and our biology really are. And it's not just air pollution, even microplastics, those tiny particles of plastic that are now found practically everywhere, can promote fat cell growth. That's wild. So we're talking about everything from car exhaust to water bottles potentially messing with our insulin sensitivity and contributing to weight gain. It's kind of overwhelming, to be honest.
It can feel that way, yeah. But knowledge is power. The more we understand about these hidden factors that impact our health, the better equipped we are to, make informed choices and take action.
You're right. So what can we do? If we want to lower our insulin levels and combat insulin resistance, where do we even start?
Well, Dr. Bickman lays out 4 key pillars: controlling carbohydrates, prioritizing protein, not fearing fat, and frequently fasting.
Okay.
These are all things you can do without relying on big pharma or those restrictive diets that often backfire.
This sounds much more holistic and sustainable than those crash diets we often hear about. It's about making lifestyle changes, not just quick fixes. Can you break down each pillar for us?
Absolutely. Let's start with controlling carbohydrates. This doesn't mean eliminating carbs altogether, which, let's face it, is not realistic for most people. Dr. Bickman emphasizes focusing on whole, unprocessed foods and limiting processed carbs, especially the kind you find in bags and boxes with barcodes.
So swapping that sugary cereal for a breakfast of eggs and avocado, or choosing a salad with grilled chicken over a sandwich on white bread.
Exactly. It's about making smarter choices that won't send your insulin levels soaring. And for someone who's, food conscious like you, this probably already aligns with your values.
It does. I'm all about real, whole foods. What about the second pillar? Prioritizing protein. Why is that so important?
Well, protein is a powerhouse when it comes to metabolic health. It helps you feel full and satisfied, which naturally helps regulate your calorie intake. No need to count every bite. It also provides the building blocks for muscle growth and repair, which is crucial for improving insulin sensitivity.
So adding some grilled salmon to my salad or snacking on some nuts and seeds throughout the day can make a real difference.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to enjoy those healthy fats. That brings us to the third pillar. Don't fear fat.
I know, it goes against everything we've been told for years, but I'm starting to see that the low-fat craze might have been a big mistake.
The science is clear. Healthy fats are essential for our health. They help us absorb vitamins, support hormone production, and when combined with protein, they create a powerful 1-2 punch for keeping you feeling full and satisfied.
So ditching the low-fat yogurt for full-fat Greek yogurt and enjoying those nuts and seeds without guilt.
Exactly. Embrace those healthy fats. And finally, we have the fourth pillar, frequent fasting.
Okay, fasting.
Yeah.
I've heard a lot about this, but I have to admit, the idea of intentionally going without food makes me a little nervous.
It can sound intimidating, but it doesn't have to be extreme. It's not about starving yourself. Intermittent fasting, where you restrict your eating window to a certain number of hours each day, can be incredibly effective for lowering insulin levels and improving insulin sensitivity. And you might find that you naturally eat less overall without feeling deprived.
This is something I've been wanting to try. I've heard people rave about the benefits, but I haven't taken the plunge yet.
It's worth exploring. You can start gradually and see how it feels. Even small changes like pushing back your breakfast by an hour or two can make a difference.
We've covered a lot of ground here, from the fast lane and slow lane to insulin resistance to its potential link to Alzheimer's disease and the impact of those sneaky environmental toxins.
But I think for our listener who's feeling burnt out on those traditional weight loss methods and is looking for a more food-conscious approach, Dr. Bickman's 4 pillars offer a great starting point. It's not about deprivation, it's about making choices that support our health and well-being.
I completely agree. It's about shifting our mindset from weight loss to health gain. And that's a much more empowering and sustainable approach.
Absolutely. But Dr. Bickman also delves into a more specific dietary approach.
Hmm?
Ketosis. What exactly is ketosis and how does it fit into this whole insulin puzzle? Well, ketosis is a metabolic state where your body starts using ketones as its primary fuel source instead of glucose. This happens when insulin levels are low, usually because of carb restriction or fasting. Remember how we talked about insulin being that key signal for fat storage? Well, when insulin is low, your body flips the switch and starts burning stored fat for energy, producing ketones in the process.
So instead of relying on glucose from carbohydrates, our bodies can learn to tap into our fat reserves for energy. It's like becoming a fat-burning machine.
Exactly. And as we've touched on before, ketones are a super efficient fuel source, especially for the brain. Some studies even suggest that they can enhance cognitive function and protect against neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued by this whole ketosis thing. But are there any downsides to this approach? I mean, completely restricting carbs sounds pretty extreme.
Well, there can be some adjustments and things to consider. One potential downside is a temporary reduction in metabolic flexibility.
And what exactly does metabolic flexibility mean?
It refers to your body's ability to, smoothly switch between using glucose and fat for energy depending on what's available.
So if someone's been on a ketogenic diet for a while, they might have a harder time processing carbs if they suddenly reintroduce them.
That's possible. Their body might take a bit longer to, clear glucose from the bloodstream, leading to a bigger spike in blood sugar. However, Dr. Bickman stresses that this is usually a temporary effect, and with a careful reintroduction of carbs, the body can regain its metabolic flexibility.
That makes sense. It's like any skill. If you don't use it, you lose it. But with practice, you can get back to that level of proficiency.
Precisely. Now, another concern people often bring up with keto is the impact on the gut microbiome.
Right. There's been a lot of talk about how restricting certain food groups, especially plant-based foods, can harm the gut microbiome. What's Dr. Bickman's take on that?
Well, he's pretty firm on this point. He doesn't believe that a ketogenic diet is harmful to the gut microbiome. He says there's simply no solid scientific evidence to support that claim. In fact, he even points to a case study where a man switched to a purely carnivorous diet for an extended period and saw no significant changes in his gut microbiome diversity.
Wow. That's fascinating. So this whole idea that we need to constantly be eating a huge variety of plant-based foods to keep our gut happy might be a bit overblown.
It seems that way. While having a diverse gut microbiome is generally considered a good thing, Dr. Bickman argues that we need more research to understand which specific types of bacteria are truly beneficial for human health. He suggests that focusing on a diet that promotes metabolic health, even if it's less diverse in terms of plant-based foods, might be more impactful for our overall well-being.
This is all such valuable information. But I know we've got to address the elephant in the room. Exercise, where does that fit into the picture? And what about those other hot-button topics like salt and artificial sweeteners? I'm dying to know.
Okay, let's unpack those. All right, let's talk exercise. I know it's important for overall health, but is it really crucial for managing insulin resistance?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Well, Dr. Bickman is a big advocate for physical activity. He emphasizes that, any movement is better than none. But when it comes to boosting insulin sensitivity, he says building muscle is where it's at.
So hitting the gym and lifting weights or doing those body weight exercises that really challenge our muscles.
Exactly. Building muscle helps improve insulin sensitivity because muscles are major glucose consumers. When they're working, they can pull glucose from your bloodstream without even needing insulin.
So basically, building muscle gives our cells another way to access glucose, making them less reliant on insulin. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's like creating a more efficient energy transportation system within your body.
Okay. What about salt? There's so much conflicting information out there. Is it bad for us, or do we need more of it? I'm so confused.
Well, Dr. Bickman addresses this confusion head on. He points out that while too much salt can temporarily raise blood pressure, restricting salt too much can actually make insulin resistance worse.
Wait, so cutting back on salt could actually hinder our efforts to improve insulin sensitivity. That's the opposite of what I've always heard.
It seems counterintuitive, but that's what the research suggests. When we restrict salt, our bodies try to compensate by holding on to more sodium and water, which can lead to increased insulin resistance.
So maybe that old advice to drastically reduce our salt intake wasn't so wise after all.
It seems that way. Moderation is key, of course, but completely demonizing salt might be doing more harm than good, especially for those of us struggling with insulin resistance.
Okay, that makes sense. What about artificial sweeteners? They seem like a good way to satisfy a sweet tooth without spiking insulin, but are they really harmless?
Well, Dr. Bickman delves into different types of artificial sweeteners and their potential effects, particularly aspartame and sucralose. He personally avoids sucralose because studies have shown that it can cross the blood-brain barrier, and the potential long-term effects on the brain are still unknown.
So sipping on a diet soda with aspartame might be okay occasionally, but those sugar-free candies or desserts with sucralose are probably best avoided.
That's his take on it. Ideally, minimizing artificial sweeteners altogether is best, but if you're going to indulge in a treat now and then, choosing aspartame over sucralose might be the lesser of two evils.
This has been so eye-opening. We've gone deep into the world of insulin resistance, from the fast lane and the slow lane to its potential connection with Alzheimer's disease and the impact of environmental toxins. It's a lot to process.
It is. It's a complex topic, but understanding these underlying mechanisms can be truly empowering.
You're absolutely right. And for our listener who's looking for a way to break free from those frustrating traditional weight loss methods and wants a more food-conscious approach, Dr. Bickman's 4 pillars provide a great roadmap. Control those carbs, prioritize protein, don't fear fat, and embrace frequent fasting. These are sustainable lifestyle changes, not quick fixes.
Absolutely. And it's so encouraging to realize that, we have more control over our metabolic health than we often think. By making smart choices about what we eat, managing stress, getting regular exercise, and being mindful of our environment, we can take charge of our insulin sensitivity and pave the way for better health.
It's a journey, not a destination, right? And every step you take toward becoming more insulin sensitive is a win. I love that.
That's the truth.
Well, I think this has been such a fascinating discussion, but we are out of time for today. I really want to thank you for joining us and sharing your expertise on such an important topic.
It's been my pleasure.
For our listeners, we hope this deep dive has empowered you with knowledge and motivation to take control of your health. Remember, you've got this.